Hello, this is Dr. James Camp at Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and this is the anatomy of the vascular system, anatomy of the blood vessels. Today we're going to talk about the idea of arteries, capillaries, and veins. We're going to talk about three tunics associated with most blood vessels and compare and contrast the tunic thickness. We're going to talk about the structure and function of different types of blood vessels, define vasoconstriction and vasodilation, list the types of capillaries, and describe the functional significance of the venous reservoir. We're also going to talk about the idea of anastomoses and other kinds of flow paths. Okay, but first we're going to talk a little bit about vascular gross anatomy. So any circulatory system, as we mentioned, has three parts: the pipes, the pumps, and the fluids. The pumps we have taken care of in the cardiac anatomy lecture, the pipes we're going to take care of today. There are 5 levels of blood circulation here, okay? We have the heart, of course, which pumps blood through to the arteries. These are large blood vessels, large notable blood vessels that are the same largely in every patient, from not very different from one person to another, and so they all have names. Then we have arterioles. These are somewhat smaller blood vessels, and they branch off the arteries to carry blood into a particular organ. And the blood vessels that they carry blood to are capillaries. Capillaries never exist as individual units. They're always present as what's called a capillary bed. Okay, and capillary beds are these sort of tangled networks of very small blood vessels that are very small in diameter, about the size necessary to allow one blood cell to travel through them, and very small in thickness as well. The wall thickness is thin enough that oxygen and carbon dioxide and nutrients and waste products can all diffuse across these walls. As blood leaves the capillary beds, it's collected into venules. Venules then exit the organ usually, and or at least collect the blood from the organ into a vein that drains that organ. And then the veins send blood back to the heart. This is an interesting point. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. So you can remember a little 2-word phrase, arteries away, both start with an A, okay? So arteries always carry blood away from the heart, no matter what color that blood is. So when a lot of people think arteries are always red and veins are always blue, and that is true for the systemic circuit, okay? But all of the arteries in the pulmonary circuit are carrying blue blood away from the heart toward the lungs, and all of the veins in the pulmonary circuit are carrying red blood from the lungs back to the heart. Veins return blood back toward the heart, and another way of putting this is, if you want to think about the organs instead of the heart, we say that arteries supply blood to an organ and veins drain blood from the organ. Doesn't mean that you ever actually drain the blood out of an organ. It just means that as blood leaves the organ, it's being drained by a vein. Okay. The pipes come in 2 colors. Typically speaking, we talk about blood being 2 colors, red and blue. It's not exactly correct to say that blood is either red or blue, but it's a close enough approximation, and it's um, a good it's a good way to think about the different kinds of blood. Oxygen makes it red, and carbon dioxide makes it blue. And as you can see from this picture over to the side, we have essentially a two-loop system. We have the pulmonary loop or circuit that goes from the right side of the heart back into the left side of the heart, and we have the systemic circuit or loop that goes from the left side of the heart back to the right side of the heart. So what color are most of the body's arteries and veins? Well, you by far have more arteries and veins in the systemic circuit than you do in the pulmonary circuit. So most of your arteries are red, most of your veins are blue. Okay. Before you go off and study your vascular gross anatomy, I have a few key terms to define here. The first is a trunk. A short artery, though sometimes we talk about venous trunks as well, but usually we talk about if something is named a trunk, it's usually an artery. A trunk is a short artery that quickly branches off into two or more smaller, more specific arteries. So coming off the aorta, the first major branch off the aorta, the first branch off the aorta, of course, is the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. But the first major branch is the brachiocephalic trunk, and it splits into the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery. Even more complicated is the celiac trunk, which is the first major branch off the abdominal aorta, and it splits into the left gastric, the splenic, and the common hepatic arteries. Okay, so that's actually a trunk that splits into three pieces. A common artery, another common bit of terminology, is for an artery that splits, is that if you have a fairly long artery, but then it splits into two smaller arteries, but they're both still going in more or less the same direction, or they both, for some reason, have the same designation, the one before it splits is called common. So the common carotid artery splits into the internal carotid artery and the external carotid artery. We also have portal veins, which go from one organ to another instead of back to the heart. We often color code these purple because they're sort of in between the red arteries and the blue veins. So the hepatic portal vein draws blood from the splenic vein, the gastric vein, and the two mesenteric veins. Okay. So now you have the terminology you need. You're armed and ready to go out and study the arteries. I'm not going to walk you through every artery in the body here. That's what my dragnet exercises are for. We'll get to those later. Okay, a couple of things about the gross anatomy of the blood vessels, though. The pulmonary circulation holds about 18% of the blood in your body. The heart holds about 12%. The systemic circulation holds about 70% of the blood in your body. A large part of that, this 18% is the amount of blood circulating through the lungs in, essentially one cardiac output cycle. So you would expect a similar 18% to be circulating through the systemic circulation in each cardiac output event. Because each side of the heart, the left and the right, they pump the same amount of blood. You can't have blood accumulating on one side of the heart or the other. So that means that there's another about 52% of blood that's not moving. If 18% of your blood is moving through the systemic circulation each time the heart pumps, is the other 52% not moving? In fact, that's possibly true, and we'll get back to where that stagnant or at least very slowly moving blood is, and it's called the venous reserve, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. Okay. Y'all remember the flow pathway through the heart. I'm going to summarize it real quickly for you here. Blood returns to the heart via the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, or the coronary sinus on the back of the heart. Blood enters the right atrium, goes through the tricuspid valve. It's now in the right ventricle, goes through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk, branches into pulmonary arteries, and hits the pulmonary circulation. And that pulmonary circulation takes the blood through the lungs, where it now returns to the heart via 4 pulmonary veins. Blood enters here the left, that's an L, atrium, goes through the mitral valve, is now in the left ventricle. The left ventricle pumps the blood through the aortic valve into the aorta. There are many, many branches from there, and that puts us back into the systemic circulation that will then dump blood back over here, and that makes it a circulatory system. Okay, so that's a very simple circuit tracing. What if we add in all of the blood vessels that are necessary to do this? Okay, the right forearm, the descending colon, the dorsum of the left foot, the muscular wall of the right ventricle, the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. What if we traced the blood all the way to one of those things and then all the way back to the heart? Or rather, what if we started from the right forearm and traced the blood back through the heart and back to the right forearm? Well, we'd start obviously coming back to the heart, so we'd start in the venous system. There are a number of veins running through the arm. We might pick, for example, the basilic vein, which empties into the axillary vein, which empties into the subclavian vein, which empties into the brachiocephalic vein, which empties into the superior vena cava. Okay. This takes us then to the right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle, pulmonary valve, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries. There are then branches within the lungs, I think bronchial arteries, they're called. Don't quote me on that. Then pulmonary capillaries, where we pick up oxygen. Then we have bronchial veins, and then pulmonary veins, which bring us back to the left atrium, the mitral valve, the left ventricle, the aortic valve. And here we're going to say that we're going to talk about the fact that the aorta is not just one giant blood vessel, though it is a giant blood vessel. It has parts to it. So there's an ascending aorta, an aortic arch. If we were heading down to the legs or the abdominal organs, we'd then go to the descending thoracic aorta and then the abdominal aorta, but we're not. Right now we're branching off to the arm. I think we said we were going to the right arm, which makes a difference here because it's whether you're going to use the brachiocephalic trunk or not. So we'll go to the right arm, brachiocephalic trunk, which branches into the right subclavian artery, which branches into the right axillary artery, which branches into the right brachial artery. Then I don't know if we're going to the inside or the outside of the arm, so we're either going to go to the radial or the ulnar artery. And then that brings us down to the various smaller arteries of the hands. So that's one complete flow circuit from essentially from your wrist up through the heart, through the lungs, back to the heart, back to the wrist. Okay. I want y'all to be able to do this for any blood circuit in the body, but in particular, I want you to practice going from the foot up to the heart, through the lungs, back to the heart, back down to the foot, just like we did here. I want you to try it from the intestines up through the hepatic portal system to the liver, to the heart, back down to the intestines. I want you to try tracing blood through the coronary arteries and cardiac veins of the heart, or around the heart. And I want you to try blood flow to the anterior lobe of the cerebrum, to the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. Okay. So in summary, deoxygenated blood is pumped through the right atrium and then the right ventricle. It flows out into the pulmonary trunk, a large elastic artery. I can write better than that. Then it flows into the pulmonary circuit, which consists of flowing out to the lungs through the pulmonary arteries, which even though they are arteries, they are blue, returning to the heart through the pulmonary veins, which even though they are veins, they are red. Oxygenated blood is pumped through the left atrium and then the left ventricle. It flows out into the aorta, a giant elastic artery. Then it flows into the systemic circuit, which contains a few subcirculations. The coronary circuit supplies the heart. The cerebral circulation supplies the brain. And there's a special feature there called the cerebral arterial circle. Used to be called the circle of Willis, which I thought was great because my childhood family doctor was a Dr. Willis, and I thought he must have gotten teased to no end in medical school. Oh, you have a circle, man. The hepatic portal circulation carries digested nutrients through the liver. And the renal circulation filters blood through the kidneys. There are other circulations that don't have specific names for the upper and lower limbs, the head and the neck, and that sort of thing. Finally, blood returns to the heart through the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava, a pair of giant veins, or if you happen to be taking a trip around the heart, it returns to the heart through the coronary sinus. Okay, so that's our 24-minute tour of vascular gross anatomy. Let's see if we can make short work now of vascular histology. Okay. We've met the word tunic before in A&P1 when we talked about the layers of the eyeball. There were a vascular tunic and a fibrous tunic and a nervous tunic. Well, we're going to revisit that layer, that idea again for 3 layers of the blood vessel. There is an inner layer made of, just like the lining of the heart, simple squamous endothelium, and this is called the tunica interna, or sometimes instead of interna, they call it intima because it is in intimate contact with the blood. Then there's a layer of various thicknesses depending on what type of blood vessel we have, and various compositions. It may have squiggly elastic fibers in it, or it may have muscle fibers here. But this is called the tunica media, and it is the middle layer and it's made of smooth muscle plus elastic fibers. Now let's talk for a minute about why you would want each of these things in a blood vessel. Smooth muscle, well, we'll get to smooth muscle in a second. Elastic fibers are notable for basically one function. They're able to stretch and snap back. That is, they can go from their squiggly state to a stretched out state, and they will snap right back to their more squiggly conformation. So why would we need that in the wall of a blood vessel? Well, you've probably noticed that when you get your blood pressure taken, there's a low number and a high number. The high number is called systolic and the low number is called diastolic, and we'll learn why those are called those things in the next lecture when we talk about the cardiac cycle. But suffice it to say for now, when that higher blood pressure is being output by the heart, that's going to stretch your blood vessel. More pressure equals more stretching. When the lower blood pressure returns, the diastolic pressure, the blood vessel needs to snap back to its normal position and push all that blood forward through the blood vessel. So the natural composition, the natural component you would weave into a blood vessel for that function would be an elastic fiber. But what about these smooth muscles here? Smooth muscle has one ability. Smooth muscle fibers are these little squashed football shapes. They can contract. They can get smaller. Okay. And why would you want to do that? Well, if you have a circle of these smooth muscle cells, when they all contract, they form a smaller circle of smooth muscle cells, or squashed football cells. So contraction of the smooth muscles equals constriction of the blood vessel. Okay. In other words, the blood vessel, the smooth muscle cells can contract, and so the blood vessel gets narrower. Why would you want to do this? That's the ultimate question I'm trying to ask here. And the answer is constricted equals higher blood pressure, less flow. Okay, so we might want to constrict our blood vessels to increase the blood pressure. Okay, that does happen sometimes. We might want to, it's part of your fight or flight response, we might constrict our blood vessels to control flow. Okay? And to give you an explanation of that, imagine that you live in a suburb like Baytown. Okay? And there's a lot of traffic to a nearby big city like Houston, H-Town. And there are two freeways that carry traffic, we'll call them Road A and Road B, that carry traffic from Baytown to Houston and back during rush hour. Well, let's say somebody closes down one of the lanes on Freeway B. So Freeway B is constricted. Okay, what's going to happen? Well, a lot of the traffic that would have been going on B is going to reroute itself to Road A, and so you'll have extra traffic traveling on Road A and much less traffic traveling on Road B. And the same thing happens in blood vessels. If you constrict one set of blood vessels, that's going to decrease blood flow to that organ and allow more blood to go to the organs that haven't constricted. Why would you want to do that? Well, again, let's revisit that fight or flight response. When you're running from an angry bear in the woods, for example, and you're in your fight or flight mode, you don't want extra blood going to, say, digest the snack bar that you ate just a few minutes ago, or to filtering your blood through the kidneys, or any of these other vital systems, but not vital for that moment. So you constrict the blood vessels that go to the digestive system and the kidneys, and that allows more blood to travel, forces more blood to travel to the muscles that are helping you run away from this bear. Later, when you've survived that incident and you're kicked back around the campfire eating s'mores, you can constrict the blood flow to your muscles and allow more blood flow to go to your digestive system to help you digest the food you're eating. Okay, so that's why the tunica media has smooth muscle. Okay, in somewhat more than a nutshell. And then there is a layer around the outside of fibrous tissue. This is called the tunica externa, though again, instead of externa, sometimes it's called adventitia. It's kind of an older name for it. And this is made of fibrous connective tissue, and it serves to kind of glue the blood vessel in place. It also has this interesting thing, in large enough blood vessels, there are small vessels in the tunica externa that provide a blood supply for all that smooth muscle. These are called vasorum, literally vessels of the vessel. Okay, blood vessels that feed the blood vessel. Okay, so here is a side-by-side view, artist's conception of an artery versus a vein versus those three other types we talked about: arterial, venual, and capillary bed. Let's look first at the differences between the artery and the vein. You'll notice that the tunica intima is about the same in both of them. Very thin, simple squamous tissue, except that in the vein, there are parts of the tunica intima that fold into valves. Okay? Why do we have valves in our veins? Because by the time blood has traveled through the artery, through the capillary bed, and gets to the vein, it's run out of all of its blood pressure. It's run out of all of its forward-moving energy, if you will. And so there's a very good possibility that this blood would turn around and start to fall back down just due to gravity. So we build valves into our veins every so often to catch that blood and make sure that it is still traveling in the correct direction toward the heart. Why don't we have valves in arteries? Because we have plenty of blood pressure in the arteries to make sure that the blood goes in the right direction. Okay. The other thing you'll notice is that the lumen of the vein is considerably wider than the lumen of the artery, right? This is for about the same reason. When you have a lot of blood pressure, you don't need a very big straw to push that blood through. When you have not much blood pressure, you need a very wide pipe to push that blood through. Finally, let's note that there's a significant difference in the tunica media between these. The artery has a much thicker, smooth muscle layer in the tunica media. The vein here has a very thin tunica media. Again, that's because of the functional difference between these. Arteries are carrying blood to organs, and if you want to control whether an organ is getting blood or not, it's better to control the blood going to the organ than to control the blood leaving the organ. So if we're trying to constrict the blood flow to our stomach, for example, it's the gastric artery that needs to constrict, not the gastric vein. Okay. And finally, let's take a quick look at the capillary here. The capillary has only an endothelium and a basement membrane. So it is basically the tunica intima, and that's it. And that is to allow rapid exchange of oxygen and nutrients across the wall of the capillary to the organ that it's supplying. All right, so take a moment, pause the video if you need to, figure out which of these is an artery and which of these is a vein. Did you guess correctly? This is the artery because it's got a thick tunica media, and it's got a thin lumen. The vein over here has a thin tunica media and a very wide lumen. Okay. Finally, let's talk about types of blood vessels. There are elastic arteries. These are basically the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. And they have very dense collections of those squiggly elastic fibers in here. The tunica media is almost entirely elastic fibers. Most arteries that branch off of that are muscular arteries. That means they have just a very thin bit of squiggly elastic fiber on the outside and on the inside, and everything else is smooth muscle tissue. Why the difference? Well, the aorta always carries blood. There's no reason to constrict it. So there's really no need for a huge amount of smooth muscle there. But the aorta takes the full brunt of the blood pressure coming out of the heart, so it needs to be able to stretch and snap back and stretch and snap back and stretch and snap back. Okay. Branching off of muscular arteries are the arterioles, which look very much like a muscular artery, only in miniature. And arterioles also do a lot of the constricting to control blood pressure and blood flow patterns. This shows the lumen of the tunica intima and media, mainly the tunica media, of an elastic artery on top, a muscular artery in the middle, and an arteriole on the bottom. Capillaries join the arterioles to the venules. Capillaries look like this, very thin wall of endothelial cells here. Okay, the whole artery is maybe about 1 blood cell in thickness. That's about 10 micrometers in thickness. And capillaries have a couple of interesting properties to them. Capillaries always exist in beds. You'll never find a single capillary by itself. And sometimes those capillaries have what's called a thoroughfare channel, one capillary that runs through the middle and carries blood flow straight from arteriole to venule. And usually that blood flow is going off into other directions as well, but you can close these precapillary sphincters and shut off the blood flow so that it only travels through from arteriole to venule. Why would you want to do that? Because sometimes, again, we don't want blood going to every part of our body. We actually don't have enough blood in our body to feed all of our organs at the same time. So shutting off non-essential capillary beds when we're not using them conserves that blood flow for the parts that we need. Capillaries come in various types. The most common type is called a continuous capillary. The basement membrane links the endothelials themselves link together by tight junctions and such into a continuous sheet of cellular material. So for diffusion to happen in this, things have to actually travel through the wall of the capillary. A fenestrated capillary happens in organs that have a lot of nutrient exchange and other fluid exchange between the blood vessels. They have these tiny holes called fenestrations that allow bulk flow of fluid into and out of the blood vessel. They're still much too small to allow individual cells to travel through, but bits of fluid containing nutrients can travel through. The small intestine is an example of this for absorbing nutrients. The kidneys for filtering blood. most endocrine glands to permit hormones to be absorbed into the blood from the endocrine gland. There's also a type of blood vessel called a sinusoid. These are found in the liver and the spleen and the bone marrow, where actual exchange of cells between the inside and outside of the blood vessel is necessary. And they have very large openings that give room for an actual blood cell to travel in and out of this sinusoidal capillary. Okay, venules collect the blood from capillary beds and take them to small to medium-sized veins, collect the blood into large veins. There's not a real difference like there is between elastic and muscular arteries between the large veins and the smaller veins. Their tunica intima is the same with valves. Their tunica media is the same with a small amount of smooth muscle and a small amount of elastic tissue. The major difference is that the large vein has vasovasorum in its tunica externa, whereas the smaller veins don't necessarily need that. Okay, one last note on blood flow pathways. There are simple pathways that just travel through one arteriole, one mess of capillaries, one venule, and we're done. There are, or rather I should say, this is probably traveling through one named artery, and then a couple of arterioles, a mess of capillaries, a couple of venules, and a named vein. Anastomoses are pathways where there's more than one pathway to get where you're going. One example of an arterial anastomosis is the network of veins around your knee, because every time your knee flexes, it compresses certain arteries. There are other arteries that then open and allow blood to flow. But that ultimately is why locking your knees in one position is kind of bad for you, whether that's kneeling for a long time or standing at attention for a long time. You need to flex your knees to allow those different arterial anastomoses to work themselves out. The most famous arterial anastomosis is the cerebral arterial circle, where the vertebral arteries come together to form the basilar artery. It branches out a couple of ways. The internal carotids come up and join this. And then there are these circulating arteries that form a circle, so that if blood is interrupted to one of these arteries, if there's a blood clot here, say, blood can flow around the entire rest of the circle to feed that part of the brain. So anastomoses typically happen in places where you need that kind of redundant flow pathways to prevent trouble from happening. Last but not least, we're going to talk about how valves and muscles work together to aid venous flow. I mentioned that by the time flow reaches the veins, there's very little blood pressure. To give a little more extra blood pressure, a little more oomph, deep veins that run through a skeletal muscle. When the skeletal muscle contracts, it squeezes the vein shut, or pinches the vein in that position. That pushes some of the blood up and some of the blood down, but because of the system of venous valves, the blood that goes down is caught and actually ultimately ends up going up as well. This shows how a contraction relaxation cycle works to move blood through those veins. Ultimately, this is why you're supposed to stand for a little bit every hour, why you're supposed to move your arms and legs, even if you're, especially if you're at a work situation where you sit at a desk most of the time. Walking around keeps the blood moving through your deep veins and prevents deep venous thrombosis from happening, which can be a big downer later in life. Okay. Next up after this will be cardiac physiology, so stay tuned.